Hello, everybody. This is John Burroughs coming at you for Rattle and Numb Live, episode number 2. Here we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 quarantine situation, so I'm wearing the appropriate shirt, hopefully. If you're scared, stay home. I'm scared, so I'm staying home. The poem I'm sharing in this episode is the second poem in my latest book, Rattle and Numb, New and Selected Poems 1992 to 2019. And the poem is entitled John Cage, Engaged and Uncaged. Sunken, funkin, telepumpkin. Tell a country bumpkin who I am, and then let him tell you. Both will tell it true, though their perspectives seem contradictory. I'm born of hickory and rectory, blind Bartimaeus, and insightful inspectory, true tale and muddled myth on an identical trajectory. John Cage, or someone like him, is anyone like anyone more than anyone is unlike, said disharmony does not exist, though even we peaceniks are pissed. Corn is not hominy, but hominy is corn. And care isn't clothing, though care can be worn. And all can be born, and all can be torn, and loved, and forlorn, and warned, and scorned, and according to some bother or brother or other, reborn. Sunken, funkin, telepumpkin, born of a couch potato and a pureed tomato, an almost dead and buried berater, blind hate hater, thin ice skater, war of horror, saint and horror, mental and governmental master baiter. And sooner or later, repeat reincarnator. I am a living death, an awakened dream, ash unconsumed, and a silent scream. Reconcilable so-called contradiction and factual fiction. John Cage, uncaged, inadequately aged, and yet timeless. A sublime mess, subconsciously clothed and consciously undressed. Said less and better are no worse than best. Corn is hominy, and there is no disharmony, only harmonies to which our ears and our fears are unaccustomed. John Cage, Engaged and Uncaged, from Rattle and Numb. Okay, so this poem is meaningful to me for a number of reasons, and so we'll have a little bit longer discussion than we might for some other poems. But it came at a very important time to me. 2008 is when I wrote it. In 2008, I had not been writing poetry for 10 years. I began writing poetry when I was in high school. I loved it. I was passionate about it, but it was very much a personal thing. You know, I had a few little things published in little magazines, but for the most part, I just wrote prolifically for myself. A form of therapy, a form of, learning about myself, evolving as a human being. But it was kind of personal, and it wasn't what people would call very good writing most of the time, but it was useful. It was meaningful to me. So from, the early 80s when I began writing, I continued writing until like 1998 when I was in a creative writing class through Ohio University's distance learning program. And something kind of snapped inside me where I decided, poetry was not the way I wanted to express myself. I felt to some degree that I had kind of outgrown it. Um, and so in 98, I began focusing on other forms of writing plays, songs, doing theater, writing tons of letters, other forms of prose. And it wasn't until 2008 when I was blogging on MySpace and kind of almost desperate for new content. I was getting a lot of followers and readers and people engaging with the blog, but that required me to keep posting new stuff and not just the same things all the time or the same types of things. So I thought, it'd be fun. I had written this poem. I wasn't even sure if it was a poem or a rap. It was just kind of a riff. But I shared it on my blog and got some good feedback from some poets, living poets who the dead poets weren't responding. But poets who, I had connected with and befriended on MySpace, but hadn't met in person because until that point, I didn't realize there was a lot of living poetry community around the Cleveland area. I was kind of, I don't know, cloistered. So I shared this on my blog. People liked it. I got convinced to go to poetry readings. I got good feedback, met some good friends. And all in the course of this year, this was in May 2008. I first shared this poem live at the Barking Spider, my first ever poetry open mic. And by the end of the year, I had founded Crisis Chronicles Press. Diane Borsenek and I were hosting a monthly Licks and Kicks poetry extravaganza. Was doing all sorts of things. So my life totally changed. I had found a new family, my creative poetic family that I didn't know existed. But the other reason, not just the time and when it was written, and it was the first poem I ever read at an open mic or in front of people. In addition to that, it was very meaningful to me because of the subject matter being so autobiographical, and revealing of myself. I was born of hickory and rectory. Well, I was born in Richwood, West Virginia, pretty much a little city in a valley surrounded by forest. So that was the hickory. The rectory was, I had come from a Southern Baptist church background. My dad, was a minister. He had a congregation in LaGrange, Ohio for a while. He was a deacon of Chestnut Ridge Baptist Church. He was also chaplain to prisoners in local jails. And so also my biological father, who I had never even met more than once in my life, was also involved in ministry, music ministry, etc. So I had come from both of those, hickory and rectory, and yet anybody seeing me at the Barking Spider or wherever reading the poem, the 2008 John, it would not have been obvious that I was from West Virginia or that I was from a religious background. It was very irreverent, and so I felt like I needed to claim those parts of my, my roots, my upbringing, that in some ways I had run from for many years. There's also, different references in there. Blind Bartimaeus was a character in the Bible, a blind person who had approached Jesus in the New Testament, asking him, what can I do? And well, you can look up the references if you want. I mean, most of them are pretty obvious. I did read in an article somewhere that John Cage had said disharmony does not exist, and I had gone off on that, obviously. But many years before I wrote this poem in 2008, in the 90s, I was voraciously reading John Cage books before I really even knew his music that well. I mean, I knew, he had the silent piece. I knew that he had put pennies under piano strings to temper, change the sound of the instrument. But it was more his writing than his music that I was drawn to originally. I was a reference librarian or reference clerk in the library at Marion Correctional Institution, and just getting as many books of his as I could from interlibrary loan. And one of them was Silence, which I believe might have been his first book. And in Silence, he says, composing's one thing, performing's another, listening's a third. What can they have to do with one another? Well, that's been in not in those exact words, but that question has been in the forefront of my mind and in deep in my spirit when I've been writing poetry and approaching poetry for at least the last 12 years, 15 years, I don't know. Trying to see what the composing, the performing, and listening have to do with one another, and try to integrate them, weave them together, and make all three of them equally important in any given poem, so that reading it on the page, it works. Performing it live, it works. But also it works in the listening, in different ways. It communicates to the listener. It's accessible to them to some degree, or at least provoking them, or but also my own listening, not just referring to the listeners, but my own listening to the silences in between the phrases, in between the line breaks, in between the thoughts, incorporating. The silence is sometimes as important as a word. I remember in an early poetry workshop I took with Phil Metris at the Avon Lake Public Library. This was probably around 2008-9. I would overcompensate in performance because I was more confident in performance, having been involved in theater, than I was actually in poetry. So I gave a lot more focus to performance, and I also tended to read quickly, rapidly, like rapid fire, like rap, or like a machine gun, and play with the words that way. And Phil Metris said, something to the effect of, you can never read a poem too slowly. Something like that. And that, along with remembering certain things by John Cage, I started, slowing down. And I think that was a good way to approach it. Anyway, I've said too much about this poem already. It's one of my more, it's probably, the poem I've read the most in public settings. In part because I had it memorized, in part because it's autobiographical, and I felt like it was a good introduction to me. I felt like it was a solid piece. For a long time, I would start my readings with it. Now I've kind of gotten to the point where I'm kind of sick of reading it. Kind of like, Lou Reed said he on Take No Prisoners album, the audience was cheering for him to do Walk on the Wild Side, and then he eventually reluctantly did it, and then went into a kind of a rant about how, he was sick of it. No matter how good something is, I love lobster, but if you gave me lobster for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day for 20 years, I'd be sick of it. So that was part of my hesitancy in using this poem as episode 2, but I really wanted to go through the whole book in order. And so I'm going to read the poem one more time. I don't think I need to read this one more time. I'll do that with future poems, but this one has been heard so many times, I feel like once is enough. You can always rewind it if you want to hear it again. Thank you for listening. Here I am in my office, library upstairs, and I'll try to be in a different part of the house every time I come back for a new episode. I look forward to hearing some of your videos. I'm seeing lots of great poetry videos on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, and lots of poets doing the same kind of thing. And it's really a way to build community despite being apart. And I appreciate it, and I hope you all keep up the good work. And I'll try to throw some good work out in response if possible. And take care of yourselves. Listen to the scientists, please. And we'll see each other on the other side of this, hopefully. Peace, love, and poetry.